Hi, everyone. It's so great that you're here. My name is Grant Kastner, and welcome to this Vocabulary in the World Language Classroom webinar presented by us, Extempore. I'm Extempore's community manager, and our very special guest, we are so thankful to have Mr. Joe Barcroft from Washington University in St. Louis, who's going to be talking all about vocabulary, sharing his wonderful knowledge that he has with us. So without further ado, I will hand it over to him, and he can lead the way.
Great. Thank you, Grant. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to all of you for joining and participating. And before we get started, I want to thank Extempore for the invitation, and also thank you especially to Grant and Thomas, who I've been working with in recent weeks to prepare things. So the topic of the webinar today is vocabulary in the world language classroom. And before we get into, I'm going to present an outline of what topics I want to cover, but first I'd like to start off with a little warm-up activity. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here. This is the warm-up activity. We're going to do this has two parts. The first one is 60 seconds, and the second one is also 60 seconds. So individually, please jot down in the chat as many of the factors that you can think of that affect successful second language acquisition. These factors can be related to context, learner-based factors, or any factor that you think affects how well someone learns a second language. And if you already see one up there, you don't have to repeat it, but let's see what kind of ideas we can generate in the chat. I see learner confidence, motivation, time devoted, level of interest, linguistic background. These are great. This is a nice way to generate a list of factors really quickly. Familiarity with culture, age of acquisition, teacher proficiency, meaningful context, interest and motivation, teaching skills of the instructor. Okay, a few more seconds to see if any other ideas come up. Willingness to make mistakes, someone wrote. Okay, exposure to authentic materials in the target language. Okay, great. So we have self-reliance, amount of self-reliance, analytical thinking skills. Okay, all of those are a nice list of factors. And I wanted to start off with that list because I now have a second question I want to move on to. And I think that the answer to this one, the list will be a little bit shorter. So now please list as many of the necessary ingredients for successful second language acquisition. Oh yeah, I already said Stacey Davis. Good job. The necessary ingredients you can think of for successful second language acquisition. And here we want the list to only be absolutely necessary ingredients. In other words, if you can acquire a second language in some context without it, it's not a necessary ingredient. So this is great. So far we have input. Okay, and I also see input. And I see consistency, grammar, let's see, comprehensible input. Practice, okay. Input at I+1, a good attitude, okay. All right, well, my point here, this list is clearly a lot shorter, and input is definitely at the top of this list, or one of the factors that's at the top of this list. And I wanted to start off with this warm up because I wanted to make the point that the same necessary ingredients that we need for second language acquisition, we also need for successful vocabulary learning. In other words, like language learning in general, or second language acquisition in general, vocabulary learning is always input first, and input is a necessary ingredient all around. Okay, Great. So I'm going to continue here. And what I want to show you now is the outline of the topics that I'd like to cover. Where I'll ask for participation from those who are here attending and participating. So we've done the warm-up activity, and what I want to cover are 10 different sections here. The first is, what is meaning-oriented language instruction, which includes communicative language teaching, task-based instruction, and content-based instruction. What are lexical goals? And in other words, what does it mean to really know vocabulary? 3, what is input-based incremental vocabulary instruction? And 4, why should you use this approach in meaning-oriented instruction? What are the 10 principles of IBI vocabulary instruction? And then we're going to do a little activity on different types of input and tasks. And this is where our focus is going to be. We're going to talk about the type of input and tasks that you think are beneficial. And we're going to look at some, at least a little bit of research that looks into different types of input and different types of tasks and how they affect vocabulary learning. So following that idea, for number 7, we have what type of input should I provide? Number 8, what types of tasks should I include in instruction? And then I'm going to finish up with a checklist for developing IBI lessons that focus on vocabulary. And then there'll be some time for questions and discussion. So again, you can see there's a lot of focus here on meaning-oriented instruction. And when I'm thinking about the world language classroom, I'm thinking about a world language classroom where that is the primary type of instruction that's being included. So let's go ahead and get started with point 1. What is meaning-oriented instruction? And I'm going to define it here as language instruction focused on meaning for the purpose of communicating, completing tasks, or learning content, right? And so here you can quickly see that it may have meaning-oriented instruction can have more than what we might call flavors. And one could be communicative language teaching, one can be task-based language instruction, and the other can be content-based instruction. And I think if you think of things in terms of meaning-oriented instruction overall, each of these 3 kind of seamlessly flows into one another when we're in a classroom that is meaning-oriented. Okay. What is communicative language teaching? Okay, this is probably review for most everyone here, but I just want to mention a few key points, 5 key points here. We have emphasis on developing communicative competence in communicative language teaching. We have emphasis on the provision of meaning-bearing comprehensible input and language development as the outcome of processing meaning-bearing input over long periods of time. And there are some definitions below that might be useful. In particular, when we talk about input, we're talking about samples of the target language that can be in the spoken mode or in the written mode that are used during communicative situations. 3, we have an emphasis on learner-centeredness, in which the role of the instructor is that of an architect and a model, and in which learners become active participants and become more responsible for their own learning. 4, we have an emphasis on real-life interactions, meaningful tasks, and content. And 5, emphasis on a low anxiety environment, the idea of lowering a learner's affective filter so that language acquisition is not impeded by anxiety. Okay. What is task-based instruction? Okay, again, I just want to point out, I have the link here to the international organization that focuses on task-based language teaching. That's here available to you. But basically, in general terms, task-based instruction emphasizes engaging learners in tasks. Just a couple of examples of the type of task that learners can be engaged in would be a gap completion type of task or a group decision type of task. And when it comes to vocabulary, Task-based instruction, it's important to note that you cannot obviate the general rule that vocabulary learning is input first. One second here. If novel vocabulary is going to be needed to perform a task, learners need to be exposed to vocabulary as input first in some type of pre-task, or be provided with a way to access it during the task phase itself, right? In other words, if something is truly novel, if it's not a cognate or a word that is similar to a word in the learner's first language, you're necessarily going to have to present that word in the input first. Otherwise, the learner simply won't know what it is. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about task-based instruction. And then next, what is content-based instruction? Content-based instruction harnesses the learning of content to promote language development. And what kind of content can be included? Topics like linguistics, literary and cultural studies, history, anthropology, political science, engineering, math, and so forth. And CBI is also tied to courses in learning language for specific purposes, such as for business, social science, or otherwise. When we think about content-based instruction, we know that novel content can be very motivating to students. You're learning new information while you're also learning the language. And with regard to vocabulary, again, treatment of novel vocabulary in content-based instruction typically depends on the needs dictated by the content. But again, when you're dealing with truly novel vocabulary, novel word forms that are not only cognates or that haven't been presented before, they'll need to be presented in the input first. Okay, so moving on. When we're teaching in a context that is overall is meaning-oriented instruction, we can ask, what are our lexical goals? What is it, and what does it mean to know vocabulary? And what is the target of the type of knowledge that we want students to gain when it comes to vocabulary? So here I just want to mention a few points that go beyond the simple form, meaning, and form meaning mapping. And actually those three may not be so simple in and of themselves. But in addition to learning the basic form and meaning of words, gradually over time, we need to acquire many of the other form and meaning related aspects of word knowledge, such as the collocational properties of words. And what do we mean by collocational properties? Well, collocations are words that tend to appear together, such as in English, we say baby blue, we don't say infant blue, and we say strong tea, we don't say powerful tea. And that type of knowledge is built up over time when we're attending to input and processing input in which those words co-occur in the input. We also need to learn L2 specific meanings of words. Here I have one example with Spanish. The word manzana in Spanish means apple, but there's a regional use in peninsular Spanish where it can mean a streaked block. So I live 3 or 4 apples from your house, for example. And that's something that's L2 specific, and in this case, regionally specific as well. We also need to learn L2 specific uses of words. For example, in Ecuadorian Spanish, the words burro and the word burro means donkey, conejo, rabbit, orejas, ears. And they're all associated with an idiomatic expression that's used in Ecuadorian Spanish, el burro hablando de orejas, or the donkey talking about ears. And this means something along the lines of the pot calling the kettle black. So just like in English, we have associations between words like pot, kettle, and black in this case that are tied to this idiomatic expression. The same thing happens in other languages. So we develop this kind of knowledge of words over time through input, of course, but I just wanted to point out here that even though there may be advantages to presenting single words and pictures or single words in different contexts or single words with definitions, This type of knowledge, the collocational properties, the L2 specific meanings, and the L2 specific uses really require input that's at least at the sentence level and most likely at the discourse level. So beyond just individual words. Okay, so moving on, what is input-based incremental vocabulary instruction? This is an approach to teaching vocabulary that focuses on the presentation of target vocabulary in the input and the incremental development of different aspects of vocabulary knowledge over time. The approach emphasizes the roles of comprehensible input, different types of enhanced input. We're going to see some examples. Target vocabulary being presented frequently and repeatedly in the input. And here, by frequently, I mean in one input segment, the word would appear frequently a number of times. And by repeatedly, I mean over a longer period of times, the word is recycled over longer periods of time. And also careful consideration of the relationship between different types of processing and corresponding different components of word learning that correspond, okay? So here, if you want more information, more details on this approach, here you have the reference for my 2012 book, and also there are chapters and articles on the IBI approach that, and many in PDF now, that appear on my publications page, and there's a link to that right here in this PowerPoint slide. Why use the IBI approach in meaning-oriented instruction? Here, I just want to mention in general terms, because it's theoretically grounded, it's evidence-based, it's meaning-focused, it's input-focused, it's task-based, it's content-oriented, and because of all of this, it's very seamlessly integrated into meaning-oriented instruction, whatever flavor in question. Okay. Here are the 10 principles of IBI vocabulary instruction. First, developing and implementing some type of vocabulary acquisition plan. And this may include how you select target words over time and provide for situations where you're focusing on target words that have been identified and also focusing on acquisition of vocabulary that may not be explicitly identified. That can be due to, whatever task you're working on, whatever content you're working on, whatever communicative situations you're focusing on. That can dictate the vocabulary that's going to be involved. But you might also consider word frequency in the target language, such as in the 2,000 most frequent words in a language, the 3,000 most frequent words, can be a consideration that you might want to look into, because it can allow you to it will provide learners with the opportunity to have a lot of coverage of language if you focus on those most frequent words, or at least consider it. You can have some sort of combination between the two. Number 2, present new words frequently and repeatedly in the input. And here again, by frequently and repeatedly, it's just what I explained about in the immediate context versus over longer periods of time. 3, promote both intentional and incidental vocabulary learning. Intentional being when you're intentionally trying to learn a set of target words, and incidentally when you're picking up words over longer periods of time. And again, let's say, for example, in task-based instruction or content-based instruction, a lot of incidental vocabulary learning, the decision of which words will be learned will depend on the content and the tasks in question. Number 4, and this is thanks very much to Stephen Krashen, use meaning-bearing comprehensible input when presenting new words. And this is easy to say. It's not always easy to do, especially if you're not in a situation where you're presenting words individually. When words appear in a text or in discourse, there are different ways to make them to help learners to understand the meaning of those words better. And we'll talk about some more examples of that in a minute. But overall, you want to use meaning-bearing and sufficiently comprehensible input. 5, present new words in an enhanced manner. This could be, textual enhancement or some type of enhancement in the spoken mode. And I'm going to show you one specific example of that. You also want to limit forced output without access to meaning during the initial stages. This is an output that's kind of a parroting nature where you're copying words or using a lot of choral repetition. Sometimes instructors think that that may be really useful to do a lot of that, but actually the research indicates that it's not all of that beneficial, and at least in some circumstances can have negative effects. You also may want to limit redundant semantic elaboration during the initial stages. What do I mean by semantic elaboration here? I mean focusing on the meaning and use of words based on your L1 experience. If you do a lot of redundant focusing on, deeper processing of words in the initial stages, that may be useful for some aspects of vocabulary learning, but it's important to know that that doesn't help learners acquire the novel forms of words. Number 8, promote learning L2 specific word meanings and usage over time. And as I mentioned here, we need input that goes beyond individual words and likely even beyond individual sentences into discourse level input. Progress from less demanding to more demanding activities over time. Thinking about what Nation calls the learning burden when you encounter new vocabulary, what learners have to go through to acquire novel words. We need to allow them to process novel words as input without getting in their way. And then apply any research findings with direct implications for vocabulary instruction. I think there are some research findings out there that you don't necessarily need to understand the theoretical backdrop and all of the details of the research that supports it. But if you know that there's strong evidence in favor of it, you can make use of that. And again, maybe we'll see some more of that in the coming slides here. So I want to move on here to the topic of different types of input and different types of tasks that you can have learners engage in when they're presented with new words. So here's my question. What does the research indicate about different types of tasks and ways of presenting target vocabulary as input? And here I'm going to pull up the chat to see if anyone has any questions about what I mean by the tasks and the type of input in question in the list that I'm going to present here shortly. Let me go ahead and present the list. Okay, so here they are. What I'd like you to do, and you could just do this on a scratch sheet of paper, wherever you are. I'd like you to answer the question for each 1 through 8. The 3 possible answers are positive effect, negative effect, or no effect, okay? And my question here are, what are the effects of the following tasks or conditions on second language vocabulary learning? You can assume that in most of these cases, it was intentional L2 vocabulary learning in the study in question. And you can also assume that on the post-test, where we measured how well they learned vocabulary, they had to produce the target word forms, at least in one of the post-test measures, okay? So here are the 8 items. Writing target words in original sentences based on the learner's own experiences. 2, copying target words being viewed. Again, this is a type of output without access to meaning. Okay, well, there I'm giving a hint. 3, making pleasantness ratings about word meaning. So this would be if you're presented with an L2 word and you're asked to think about how the word makes you feel. If you have a positive feeling about the meaning of the word, or if you have a negative feeling about it. 4, addressing questions in your mind about word meaning, such as when was the last time you used this item, or when was the last time you bought this item, things like that. 5, generating synonyms for target words during reading. So this would be if you see some target words during a reading and you try to generate a synonym in your first language for it. Number 6, attempting to retrieve target words on your own. So this would be after you've seen the word and its picture in the input at least once. This would be when you're shown, at least for part of the time, only the picture and you try to retrieve the target word on your own, and then you're shown the target word again. So you have an opportunity to try to retrieve it on your own from looking at a picture. Number 7, presenting target words in thematic sets instead of semantic sets. By here, if you present words by telling a story, or if you present words like sometimes they're presented in textbooks where you have all the fruits and vegetables in one chapter, and you have all the other semantic groups in other chapters, and typically even on individual pages. And last but not least, using multiple talkers, multiple speaking styles, and or multiple speaking rates when you're presenting target words, right? So the assumption on number 8 is that the number of times that the target words are repeated in the input is the same, but the difference is that you have multiple talkers instead of fewer talkers. You have many talkers instead of fewer, or just one talker. You have many speaking styles instead of just a few or fewer. That would be the manipulation, okay? So please just take a second to what you would think your ideas would be about 1 through 8. I'll give you just about 30 seconds here, 30 seconds more, and then I'm gonna let you know what the research indicates for these. For 5, synonyms are in the target language. No, for 5, the synonyms are in the first language. You're creating synonyms in the first language for words that appear in the second language. Thanks for that question. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to tell you now what the research, and a lot of research actually on lexical input processing, indicates for these different tasks and conditions. What the research indicates is that 1 through 5 all produce negative effects as compared to not doing them and just processing the input. And 6 through 8 all produce positive effects based on the research findings. So I think what's interesting here is that sometimes at least some of these may be counterintuitive at first glance, but when we think about things from a different perspective, they may seem more intuitive. Okay, so I want to move on to the next slide. Okay, and I think the research of this nature kind of converges to suggest one central implication, which is that we need to provide learners with opportunities to process new words as input, and using preferably enhanced types of input without getting in their way. In other words, some of the tasks that we saw there that might, at least at first blush, would seem intuitively to produce positive effects, don't, and can also have negative effects as compared to simply not having learners do those. Okay, so moving on now, this is sort of the take-home message that I wanted to leave with you today, talking about what types of input should I provide and what types of tasks should I engage learners in to facilitate vocabulary learning. First of all, what types of input? Meaning-bearing comprehensible input that includes the target words, input in which target words appear frequently, input in which target words appear repeatedly over time, input in which target words are enhanced in the written mode with textual enhancements, and in the spoken mode, you can use, for example, acoustic variability using multiple talkers, speaking styles, and speaking rates, as I mentioned. And input that demonstrates the collocational properties and L2 specific meanings and uses of target words, which means going beyond just individual words and phrases as input. And for both the input and the task, I want to show you at least one example study for both of these. And for type of input, I'm going to show you a study that addressed the question on what are the effects of presenting target words in acoustically varied formats. And this is a study I did with Mitch Summers from Washington University, and that came out in SSLA in 2005. And it included two types of variability that were found to have positive effects. The first was speaking style variability. So our participants were native English speakers with no formal previous training in Spanish, and they tried to learn 24 words in Spanish, such as hongos, oso, reloj, that they heard while they were viewing the picture of each word, right? So they viewed 24 words. Each word appeared 6 times, so there was 6 repetitions of each word. But here was the conditions that we included. So by speaking variability here, we had an individual speaker produce the word in different types of speaking styles, including a childlike voice, including denasalized voice, including excited voice. So it was fun creating these stimuli with the single speaker. The no variability condition, if you were a participant in the study, in the no variability condition, you got 1 speaking style with 6 repetitions each. For moderate, you got 3. For high, you got 6 speaking styles. And I want to show you the results here, both with the top figure. You can see for accuracy, we had 2 measures where the first one was a cued recall where they saw pictures and had to produce the Spanish word. And in the other, they saw the Spanish word and had to produce the English word. So if you look at the top, you can see accuracy. The proportion correct goes up from no variability. It's higher with moderate, and it's highest with high. And with latency, we also asked them to, produce the words as accurately and as quickly as they could. And you can see with the lower table that not only do they get more accurate from the top figure, excuse me, what the bottom figure indicates is that they also get faster. And then we also did another experiment on talker variability. And in this case, for the no variability condition, we had 1 speaker producing 6 repetitions. For high variability, it was 6 repetitions, 6 speakers, 1 repetition each, and the moderate variability fell in between. And here you can see the results for that. Again, the accuracy goes up, the more talker variability you have, and they also get quicker in producing them. And I want to point out that if you look at the accuracy in the top figure on the left side with the cued recall, they go from something like 38% up to around 64%. So this is quite a gain when everything else was equal, the same amount of time of presenting the words. The only difference there was the amount of variability included. And just really quickly, our interpretation from a theoretical perspective of this is that the reason the high variability is working better is because you're creating a more robust representation of the developing lexical form when you get more variability in the input. Okay, so that was about an example of input. What types of tasks should I include? Here, I'd like to recommend the tasks that allow learners to attempt to retrieve target vocabulary on their own, obviously after it's been presented in the input, because they wouldn't have any basis upon which to retrieve if it hasn't appeared before in the input. Tasks that do not impede learners' ability to attend to the formal properties of vocabulary, especially during the initial stages. And tasks that allow learners to be exposed to and make use of collocational properties and L2 specific uses of meanings and meanings of target vocabulary. So I want to show you one other study that I did that supports the first of these, the retrieval benefits. Okay, and this study is an example study on task type. What are the effects of attempting to retrieve target words? Okay, so what I did in this study is I simply provided during a learning phase an opportunity for learners, after they saw the word and its picture once, gave them opportunities to try to just see the picture and try to retrieve it on their own in their mind. And then they would get confirmation by seeing the word. And when you can see here in the results, at time 1, this was an immediate measure. At time 2, this was 2 days later, and time 3 is 1 week later. You can see when they were in the retrieval-oriented condition, they learned the words significantly better. And that was maintained over time nicely, right? There's also support for this from an early study by Royer, 1972, and also McNamara and Healy, 1995. And note that this kind of retrieval, because they're seeing a picture and they're attempting to retrieve the word form, can be considered a type of output with access to meaning, as opposed to just simply copying a word or repeating it without seeing without having a representation of the word to refer to first. Okay, just to conclude now, this is a checklist that you can use for developing input-based incremental vocabulary instruction activities. And it just helps you to incorporate all the principles and make sure you include key points of the approach. So I define target vocabulary and materials needed for the activities. I designed the activities to be meaningful, educational, and interactive. I included cultural and historical information when appropriate. And I think some of these tie into the way that you can integrate the IBI approach in whatever type of meaning-oriented instruction you're using. I presented target vocabulary repeatedly in the input first. I increased the difficulty of tasks involving vocabulary gradually over time. I incorporated a number of the principles of the approach, and I included directly applicable research findings. Okay, so I think that's a nice summary of where you can go with the approach overall. Thank you very much. And now time for questions and discussion.
Well, Joe, if you don't mind, I wanted to hold the questions before.
Oh, sure, sure.
After my little presentation. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I just wanted to show a few examples on the Extempore platform of how these ideas can be applied to directly to your teaching, and whether it's a practice method or an assessment method. And so as soon as Joe hands me the
stop share now. Okay.
Yeah, stop share, and I will share my screen and I'll show a few examples. So real quickly, Extempore, what it is an assessment platform where you can practice the 4 skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and all 3 modes of communication: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. And what I wanted to do, like I said, was to just show a few examples of tasks and assessments that can be used and where you can apply these ideas of vocabulary instruction and acquisition in your classes. So the first one that I want to show, and most of them, I was telling Joe earlier, is I feel are retrieval based primarily. So a basic weekend plans task. This is a basic formative assessment. You can see the description. This is what the student will see when they are doing this task. So they're going to make some plans for the weekend in their target language. You'll see here, I have a prompt here in English. I have a little picture attached. You can see the lovely weather here in Minneapolis. Look at the forecast and decide what you want to do this weekend. So the student has to, pull out the language. They have to produce whatever output in Spanish, French, German, Chinese, Japanese that they're speaking. Look at the forecast, and then they can easily just record a response. I'll do this in English. Well, it looks pretty bad on Friday, so I'll stay in on Friday, and then maybe Saturday it looks okay, so I'm going to go to the park. And then on the platform, what you can do is you record your response, and then on a formative where there are no timers attached, we'll see that later with timers. You can submit their attempt. The student can submit their attempt if they're satisfied with it, but if they're not, they can easily re-record their response, and they can also play it back to hear their response and say, okay, I like this, or I want to do this again. So that's one very basic formative assessment of having to retrieve the language and pull it out and say, hey, this is what I want to do. I'm going to be okay with that. And I'm going to click the second one. This is just an extra level of input is added. So I made this a little more complex, where it's the same image, the same weather forecast. But you'll see here, there's an audio file attached to it. I attached that as the instructor. So listen to your friend's message about his schedule this weekend, and then make a suggestion that fits into his interests and his schedule. So we'll listen.
Hey there, I'd love to hang out this weekend. Unfortunately, I'm busy Saturday morning and Sunday afternoon. But other than that, I'm free. Oh, and I love exploring the arts, but I'm not too big on sports. What do you want to do?
So you'll see now there are 2 levels of input, right? There's the input of the image that they are interpreting and the audio file that they just heard. So you say, okay, well, wait, he said he was free on Saturday morning and Sunday afternoon. So there's a lot of listening that they have to do. And then again, they have to produce the target language, record their response, and then submit. So those are 2 very basic assessments that you can do. And now I want to show a couple more. So this places to go on the weekend with an image. Here is a little bit more retrieval practice, where you'll see here, listen to the questions, look at the picture, and answer appropriately. So there are 3 questions. This is in Mandarin. So I teach Chinese here in Minnesota. And so you'll see the picture here, and now I can play the file.
小平在哪里？威明在哪里？
So the questions are very simple. They're asking where is, here is Xiaoping, where is Weiming, and where is Xiaobai. The student has to respond and retrieve the words of where they are, right? So Xiaoping 在电影院, so she's at the movie theater, and then Weiming at the library. But the student has to know those words already in order to produce them and properly complete the assessment. And what I like is that this image that I made on Canva is really handy, and you can use it in a variety of different ways. And I'll show those right now. So like I said, the first one, simple, where are these people? And then the students have to retrieve these words and use them in their response. In the second one, it's a bit different where it's oral reading. So again, the same image, but here I have 3 sentences. And for Chinese, I think it's really important that students read out loud because it helps them get to know the characters because it's a different script from Latin letters. So they have to read these sentences, and so they'll record their response. And again, they'll look at the image, and they'll say, the first one says, Xiaoping 在电影院. Say, okay, Xiaoping 在电影院. Is she at the movie theater? Yes, that's true. And then the second one says, 小白在医院. Here is Xiaobai. Is he at the hospital? That does not look like a hospital to me. No, so that's false. And then Wei Ming 在篮球场. Is this guy, Wei Ming, is he at the basketball court? No, he is not, right? So I have to know that these words do not match to this image. So I can stop recording, and when I'm satisfied, I can click submit. And just like that, I have finished that that question of the assessment. The last one that I want to show with this image pack here is this very basic open-ended response, which again,
你周末喜欢去哪里？
so excuse me. So you see the question there, this is open-ended, right? So the question simply asks, 你周末喜欢去哪里? Where do you like to go on the weekends? And the student has an open platform to answer that and say, okay, I like to go to the park, the convenience store, the basketball court, whatever. So it's just very, very easy for a speaking practice or a speaking assessment. Going to come back now to my class and show 2 more. I have another one that's image-based, but the question that I want to show here is a timed assessment. So here with Extempore, you can add timers. So here's just the time to review it. You'll see here 15 seconds, and a time to respond 60 seconds. And the amount of time that I've had my students say, oh, Mr. Kastner, I had no idea that there were timers. Why did I get locked out? Well, it's because there were timers. And so what lockable means is if they X out of the tab, or if they close the program, or if they click the back button, they will be locked out of the question. So this makes it a reliable summative assessment to give your students and say, okay, hey, show me exactly what you know in this amount of time. With that time to review and the time to respond. And they only get 1 single attempt. So I'm going to click OK. And here I see my image. So now this is a Chinese assessment. So say as much as you can about the picture attached using the details provided. So I have to say in Chinese to say, okay, well, do I know how to say he's 14? Do I know how to say he's in 10th grade? Do I know how to say that she's Chinese, right? And so as soon as that timer counts down, oh no, my time has already expired to review. I get a nice countdown, and I can begin my response and start saying things like, oh, Wei Ming 是台湾人, he's Taiwanese. 小平今年15岁. Xiaoping is 15 years old this year. But you get the idea? I can say as much as I can, right? I have to retrieve that language and pull it from what I already know. So now I've spoken, I've said 2 great sentences, and I have my response here. If I wanted to again, I can play it back. I get a nice countdown, and I can begin my response and start saying things like, I've said that. But if I'm happy, I can click submit attempt, and that question is now gone in this submitted section here. And the other thing, I'm not going to go through all of these because I want to have time for questions, is that just like with the image I just showed, you can use it in a variety of different ways. And now I can ask a question. 威明是哪国人? What nationality is Wei Ming? And so now I have to interpret the question that I just heard, look at the image, know the flags, and then be able to find out which one represents Taiwan. And so I find it and click submit. And so that's a very basic, multiple choice question that you can do. And then one last one that I want to show is just like the one I just did, except you can choose a writing prompt. So task can be written, and I can say, if I have my keyboard set, that would help. I can say, 小白今年 so this is sorry. But just like that, whether it's speaking or whether it's writing, you can do either mode. The student can look at the image and then submit their response. So those are just a handful of assessments that I wanted to show on the Extempore platform of how you can apply some of these ideas in your classes, in your assessments, in your tasks, whether they're formative, summative, all of that. And that's on Extempore. So if you're interested, let us know and we will gladly set you up. And now I want to open the floor for the lovely Joe Barcroft, who did such a fantastic job presenting his webinar today, for any questions or comments that you all may have about what he shared with us today. And thank you, Joe. Just wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Grant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grant, for the questions, I had some resources on a page. At some point, I can share the screen again if you'd like.
Go ahead. Yeah, please do. You are more than welcome to. We have 2 questions, please. Wendy and Dora, if you guys want to message your question in the chat, or you can post on the Q&A.
Okay, yeah. And I'll just let, let's see, I think I can still have the chat here. What I put up here is my email if anyone has any questions, and then some resources, and then also a link also to a recent edited volume that actually focused on meaning-oriented instruction in particular with vocabulary. So that notion, and it was focused on L2 Spanish, but is applicable to other languages as well. So. Okay, so did you want me to read the chat questions, Grant, or are you?
You can. I can answer some of them that apply to Extempore, that apply to Extempore, and I can wait for the ones that are held for Joe. So yeah, the checklist again. That I think a lot of people like that slide. I too like that slide. Thought it was very informative.
Oh, the check. Can we see that slide again? Yeah.
Yeah, the checklist slide. Yeah.
There we go. I see a couple related to extempore.
Yeah. So Wendy has a couple of questions. So she said, I understand the retrieval activities. Can you give some examples of increasing the difficulty of the task after initial retrieval activities, Joe?
Okay, well, the recommendation to increase difficulty of task over time would be for retrieval, but also for any kind of activity in general that you're doing. So the recommendation is simply to understand that the learner has a lot to do in terms of processing novel words as input and retaining them and all of that. So the activities that you do in the beginning should be designed to allow them really the attentional resources and the processing resources they need to be able to attend to the novel words, right? At another stage later, when they've acquired enough of the novel words in question and they're going to be working with them, that in that case, the level of difficulty of activities can increase. That was my general suggestion. Not necessarily in terms of retrieval of the target words. When if they're doing an output type activity where they're using the target words, either, let's say, I think you gave some nice examples of that, Grant, in what you were just talking about. Those kind of activities would gradually increase in difficulty over time. You wouldn't want to do, you have a set of, let's say, 24 novel, that this activity is going to involve many novel words. And the first activity that you do is the most difficult, where they're trying to produce the words and make use of them and all of that. You would want to hold off on that and consider the fact that they need to attend to those words in the input, process them, retain them to some extent over time. It's not, it's not a perfect science. It's not that they've necessarily acquired all the words perfectly, but just having that general overall perspective. That's how I would answer the question. I hope that answers it. Thank you for that. Joe, do you have any suggested number of words for providing during the input? What do you think of the super 7 verbs, frequently used words? Let me answer the first question first. I mean, the suggested number of words, I think, as language instructors, we all have experience with that. We know who our students are. It's going to depend, I think, on a number of factors, including what I would call the degree of novelty of form, the degree to which the new words in question are formally truly novel, right? So if you're dealing with, for example, as is in the case with a lot of Indo-European languages, and I deal with Romance languages, we may be doing an activity where we have a lot of cognates. If you're talking about classes or, cognates are kind of everywhere around the corner. And so in those cases, you can take that into consideration and might want to use more target vocabulary. But that same target vocabulary may be completely formally different if you're looking at a non-Indo-European language, right? So
Confirm that it is Joe.
thank you very much. So it would be difficult to make a recommendation for, one L1, and you could make a better recommendation for one L1 and one L2 to begin with. And then there are a lot of other variables that come into play. So I wouldn't want to pick a precise number. And then the frequently used words, I'm not sure. What do you think?
So I think in a lot of at least maybe secondary language teaching, there is sort of a push for like the top 7/10 to top 10 slash top 7 to 10 most common verbs in a given language, like estar and tener and maybe venir in Spanish. I don't know what the other ones would be, but I think you get the idea, right? Of sort of focusing things around those.
Right. I mean, one of the things I like to say is one of the nice things about the most frequent words in a language is that they're naturally going to occur most frequently. So if you're just simply using the language, that's going to happen regardless. But I do think there is in specialists in L2 vocabulary and those who focus on English, there are a lot more. For example, there's a lot more focus on ESL at least historically, there's been a lot of focus on vocabulary for ESL. And the use of frequency lists has really been a big topic. Identifying the 2,000 most frequent words in a language, or like English, for example, can give you substantial coverage, like over 90% coverage of the language. If you go up to 3,000, it goes way up, and you have a lot of coverage. So if you're reading a newspaper or you're having a conversation, the idea is if you covered those most frequently, then it'll give you a lot of coverage. And I imagine that the 7 most frequent verbs in a language will give you a lot of coverage, because I think the graph goes something like this. You have the most frequent first, and they're very, when they're used a lot. So yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. It would probably naturally occur anyway if you didn't pick those out explicitly, I would imagine, to a large extent. Let's see. I'm going to look for other questions. I don't see, did you see any other questions, Grant?
I did not, no. You can put your checklist back up. Claudia, it was great having you.
Thanks, Claudia.
I guess before we completely wind things down, was there a final slide that had contact information Sal mentioned?
Oh yeah, I'll go back to that then.
Yeah, just in case anybody wants to grab anything before they head on out here. And then just as a reminder, depending on how quickly Grant and I work, we will get this out to everybody this evening, or if we can't pull it off, it'll be in your inbox sometime tomorrow.
Yes. The idea is this evening. It will be on YouTube. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
I think with that, Joe, I will stop the recording and we can wrap up.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.